Good morning or afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar. We're doing things a little bit different this month. What we've done is allow our clients and users the opportunity to ask us questions for today's webinar of being a P6 user forum. We're going to be presenting some questions that were submitted to us over the course of the last few weeks. We do have a couple of housekeeping items we'd like to go through before we start the presentation. First and foremost, all of your phone lines will be muted. This allows us to preserve the quality of the audio as we are recording this webinar. Questions, we've had a lot of questions that have been submitted, but there may be some that come up during today's webinar. There is a questions box. You can submit your question, and time permitting, we may try and open up the lines to answer those questions live with you today. As part of our follow-up, everybody that has registered and that are attending today's webinar will receive an email. In that email, we're going to include a copy of the presentation, all questions and answers that have been submitted, and a link to the recording of the webinar. Presenting today's webinar is going to be Brian Chris. He's one of our principals and our Vice President of Operations. We're going to turn it over to Brian for your questions that you submitted.
All right, Dan, thank you. And as Dan mentioned, we're trying something a little bit different this month with our monthly webinars. And first of all, I want to thank everybody that took the time to send us questions. And this is actually something that I hope is going to be very beneficial for everybody, because when you attend the webinars, the purpose of this is to learn. And with DRMcNatty, one of the unique maybe values that we can offer in a discussion like this is we get to talk to a lot of different people and see a lot of different methods and things that are done within P6. So I'm very much appreciative of everybody that was able to send in questions, and so we're going to do our best to go through the questions that we've got. And I'm actually going to be in the P6 tool, and I'll kind of try to show you as much as I can, or as much as is appropriate, some live demonstrations of some of the solutions. So as I mentioned, the purpose of this is really to help engage our customers and you, the Primavera user community, so that if we're getting a lot of common questions, that a webinar we can maybe focus specifically on those questions and items, so that hopefully you can all leave from this webinar and improve a little bit in your knowledge and your efficiency in using P6. As Dan mentioned, this is the first time we're trying something a little bit different for the monthly webinar. So I would, for those of you who submitted questions or after the webinar, if you find that this is a valuable type of forum that we could maybe do quarterly, I would encourage everybody to continue to submit questions to us that we can review, and then maybe set up a subsequent webinar in the future where we address a lot of the common questions, and we can do it in the software and make it much more interactive. So the purpose of this is a learning experience for those of you in attending. And given that this is the first time we've tried this particular forum, comments and suggestions are welcome, whether it be Dan Beck or myself. Feel free to email us at any time and let us know if this is something that you find valuable, and if there's additional questions that come in, this might be something that we can do, every 6 months or 4 months, or however often we feel would be most appropriate. So with that, let's get into some of the questions that we received. The first question that we've got is related to printing of layouts, and the question specifically is asking, is there an automatic way of enabling insert of manual page breaks to improve the readability of schedules? Now, given that this is the first question, a lot of the answers may be dependent on the particular version that you are using. So for example, page breaks was in maybe a version 7 or beyond, I'm not quite sure. But there are some users out there who are still using maybe earlier versions of Primavera. The latest is, of course, 16.2, which is out, which during my demo, I'll be logging into the 16.2 environment that we have stood up on our servers. So let's go back, page breaks. Page breaks are going to be available options in two areas within P6. Number one, where we see them most commonly, is going to be in the group and sort options when we're in a P6 layout. And so we can group or page break by any of the grouping items that we have. And typically, these are going to be codes or WBS. But we also do have page break options when we are in the report editor, when we are running the tabular reports in P6. So our page break options we have in the group and sort. This may look familiar to you. When we have our grouping levels here, we will see a break option here, and I can choose to select a break at each of the phase elements like we have here, which is an activity code, or any of the WBS elements. I mentioned tabular reports earlier. If you are familiar with the report editor for the tabular reports, if we select this little green box here, which is a grouping band, and do a right click to the properties, we'll see another window pop up here, and it will provide us with some page break options. So let's go in and maybe just take a quick look at some of our page break options and how they work. So I'm going to open up a layout here. I have a number of different layouts that I've created as part of this webinar. So bear with me when we're bouncing around here. So this would be an example of, without the page breaks, I'll open up my standard layout here to start so we can just see kind of a standard layout. And then when I go and I select my print preview, oftentimes this is going to break at an odd particular place. So for example, on my second page, this is something that doesn't tell me maybe what WBS this is in or which location that this might be. The other thing to point out is when we're talking just about layouts in general, that the print previews and how the page setup is saved as part of the layout. So keep that in mind as you're developing or working with new layouts. So if I'm going to use the page break by WBS, when I open my group and sort, I can see I'm going to have it insert a page break at the level 2 of the WBS. And so now when I look at my print preview, I'll be able to see that this is going to be breaking at my WBS level 2, which in this case is named section 1. And then we have section 2 and section 3. Now, one of the things that I was interested in seeing is I thought, well, can I have this blue grouping band where we have the overall project transfer to the second and third pages when I choose a page break? And I could not find any kind of button or setting that is going to allow for that to continue the headings onto the second pages. But what it will do is it'll create a simple page break here at every level of the WBS. And as a second example, we can do it maybe by, if I have a layout where I'm using maybe a combination of work breakdown structure and say an activity code, I can choose the page break here that will show it as from one page to the next, we will break at that specific activity code. So here would be design and engineering, procurement phase, installation, and so it will create a page break with every new grouping. And so those are really the options that we have here within the layouts and the views. I was going to open up a knowledge base article. So for those of you who do not use the Oracle knowledge base or have access, I would encourage you to be able to find your way to create an account, to log in. But this is a knowledge base article I found that talks about page breaks. And in reading through towards the bottom, down on the very bottom here, it says, if desired to add a custom page break at any location, this is an existing enhancement request. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with maybe the Oracle knowledge base and the terminology, an existing enhancement request means that this has been submitted by users in the past, and they're going to take it into consideration for a future release, but it is not available in any current release of the tool. So keep that in mind as we talk about the page break. And the last thing I'll show you is in our tabular reports. I open up a simple tabular report here for our resource details. I can open up and run the print preview, and I can see that this is a 7-page report that is a list of our resource dictionary. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click and select Modify, and this will open up the report editor screen. Now, some of you may be very familiar with this, and it's not something that I do a lot of work in. It's from developing custom reports. But to simply, if I click on the data source header area, this section in green, and I right-click, this will display my properties. And now with the properties, I have this option here for page breaks. And I can select after every record or every record set. And so I'll select that, close the properties, and go to the print preview. And now we can see, rather than kind of a running total, it's broken down by the different resources under this particular hierarchy. So we have trades, and then under engineering and management. So this is how, by selecting the report header, I can click the properties and choose to insert a page break in the report. Okay. And then if I go back to the print preview, I'll see I was able to put that back. And so I'll just cancel this. I don't want to save my changes. So related to our page breaks, those are the options that we have there for page breaks. And again, at the end, if we have any additional questions, here at the end, we can kind of jump back into that. Okay, our second question is again about printing layouts. And this question asks if there is a setting that will allow the software to automatically switch activity descriptions from the right end of the activity bar to the left, so that the description will not be cut off based on the time scale to be printed. As it is now, we have to make the time scale much longer than it otherwise would need be in order to avoid cutting off activity description. And so, yeah, anybody that's had to do reports and printing off layouts has likely had to deal with this. And so on the screen here is an example of what I think this question represents, is that in the print preview, if I just use, say, the finish date, it's going to cut off at the end of the bar, where the bars end, and my descriptions are going to get cut off here, like we might see. So this is something that we'll take a look at and maybe come up with a few options here for how to address this. So I'm going to close this one particular project, and I'm going to open up, actually, I'm sorry, I'm going to stay, I'll stay in this particular project, and let's go ahead and look at maybe a sample layout for my standard view. And so when I open up the print preview, let's just see if we can kind of identify the problem here. The timescale is done in the page setup option. So if I put in here, say, a standard project latest finish date for my timescale, this is going to reproduce what we think the problem is going to be. So when I get to the second page, I can see this is my project finish. The bar is represented, but all of the descriptions are going to be cut off here. And so this is what we want to avoid. Now, I believe in maybe earlier versions of the software, perhaps P3, that it may have automatically shifted the descriptions to the left or right depending on the width of the time scale. But let's just see real quick. You know, I gave this one a lot of thought. There is no automatic way for it to sense, hey, I don't have enough room on the print preview, so I can shift to the left side of this activity here. But I wanted to maybe try a few things to say this would be potentially a workaround that you might want to try. And it's my activity name alignment is what we have here. So here is the same schedule, and this time I've added an activity code. Now this is something that you can do by adding an activity code. And then what I've done is I've created a couple of custom bars here that says activity names to the left and activity name is to the right, that I can set up these bars with where they will display to the right or to the left of each activity. And then what I did is I simply turned off the setting for current bar label, which is going to be kind of that right justified area. So for any one of these activities, we can simply change this to be a different setting, and the bar and the description can change from left to right depending on this code. Now this is actually pretty easy to work with, and I said, I was thinking, can I take this to a different type of level to make it not purely automatic, but what about incorporating a global change? So I created a global change here as a test that said if the start date for an activity is greater than 2 months. Now in this sample, the schedule I'm working with is only maybe a 3-month project in terms of the activities. Yours can be different. But if we said that where the start is greater than the data date plus 2 months, then align the activity names to the left, but for everything that's within 2 months, go ahead and keep the activity descriptions to the right. I'm going to go ahead and hit change, and it's going to ask, do I wish to proceed? So I can see I'm getting some new values populated in there. I'll commit changes and not save it to the log. And I'll say OK. So now what this has done is it's basically inserted the activity codes and the descriptions to the left or right depending on the activities. So now when I click on my print preview, it will put certain activities descriptions to the left based on when their start date is. And I can see as I get down here to the end of my schedule, rather than these descriptions running off the page, I can keep my descriptions automatically, have those move to the left side of the activity bar. So unfortunately, there is no automatic way to say, hey, make this happen. But this is one area that it was, it took maybe a few minutes to set up. If you wanted to do it manually, you could certainly use a fill down for everything here. So you didn't necessarily need to use a global change, but it is something that you can do and save your layouts along with the custom bars. And the custom bars that I created for this are essentially just a replica of the current bar label. And then we give them a filter for whether or not the activity code says to justify it to the left or justify the names to the right. So this way is not it's not as automatic as we would potentially like it to be, but rather than, particularly if you have long descriptions, rather than having your bar set and having to extend your time scale out 8, 9, 10 months, just to accommodate fitting the descriptions in there, this certainly can be a way that you can do that manually. So again, creating an activity code this one's called activity name alignment, and it's simply a value for left or right. And then creating custom bar labels that use that activity code to determine, do I display the text on the left side of the activity or display the name to the right side of the activities. So in this way, the users can control which side the text displays on. Okay. Okay, this was an interesting question because I thought, coming up with this, as I said, implementing this really did not take me a lot of time, and if it helps clean up your layouts that you're using, so your time scale does not have to go 10 months past the project, and maybe that helps clean things up and make it and make them simpler. Okay. So moving on. So this is our third question that says, I have lots of layouts and filters defined for sorting and selecting of activity codes. For example, I select a certain physical areas of the project in a contractor's schedule using a location code. However, when applying this to next month's update, the location code lines in the layout and filter are gone. Do we know why this would happen and a fix to this problem? Does it not happen when, this does not happen when selecting a WBS? So the short answer to this, to kind of cut right to the chase, is that project level activity codes, when they are stored in P6, are stored with the corresponding project ID value linked to the code, so that that project, that activity code is only visible and available for that project. So when you think about it, when we create a project-specific activity called location, what we see in P6 is the title, which is very simply called location, but what we don't see is the other tag for that code that aligns it with project ABC, for example. So when we put that in the group and sort, what P6 is really doing is identifying the code ABC location, because that's the project and the code name. When we incorporate a monthly update and apply the same layout, we are not going to see the same code because it doesn't recognize it's a different project ID. So when we're using project level activity codes, the layout retains the link to that project ID in the given database. So this was actually the question that I probably spent the most time with in trying to find some potential workarounds or ways to make this work. So, and this is a very common problem that people come up with, and what we hear quite frequently. The reason being is if I'm an owner organization, I'm trying to limit, especially if I'm going to be importing contractor schedules, we all want to limit the amount of global data that's going to come in so that we don't create any type of pollution, if you will, within the overall database. So we try to limit everything to be as project specific as possible. This would include calendars, codes, and even expenses when it comes to tracking costs. So once we understand the problem, what are the potential options? Well, the first one I put here is what we probably all normally already do, is we edit the layout monthly to use the new unique project-specific activity code that was imported within the contractor schedule. The other options that I found that did actually kind of produce positive results in terms of opening up the layout and having it preserved with each monthly update was using the update existing option. Now, this worked only insofar as it preserved the layout and I didn't have to rebuild it after importing. However, as most of you may already be aware, you would need to use quite a bit of caution with this because there are other information, specifically if we're talking about activities and logic ties. If they get removed during the update, there's a whole host of potentially other problems that could exist when you say update an existing schedule. But it is an option each and every month to update an existing version of the schedule. So if my project ID is the same and I'm simply importing new data into that schedule, my project-specific activity codes that are used for the layout should be preserved. The other option is that I tried was to look at an EPS level activity code. The main takeaway in kind of going through this option was that the EPS activity code needs to be in the receiving database first before importing, say, what would be a contractor's schedule. Okay? So let's take a look here. We'll jump back into P6. And so here would be maybe an example of our problem. And this is a schedule that we're going to say is a contractor schedule that I imported. And I'm going to open up a layout where we are grouping by a project-specific activity code. So in this schedule, I have activities, and they are using, let me move this up so everybody can see it. We have a project-specific activity code called responsibility. And I put this little note in here, PROJ, to make sure that I was clear that it's a project-specific activity code. And so here's my layout, part of the group and sort. And this would be an identification of all the activities for standard paving and concrete, Acme General Contractors, brink contractors, so on and so forth. So this is just very simply a layout that is grouped by a project-specific activity code. The problem seems to happen when I import the next monthly update. So let's say this is a brand new project ID. This is maybe my update 01 for maybe my first update. And I open this project. I'll remove this. And notice I have the same layout open, group by project-specific activity code. And now when I look in my group and sort window, it is going to be blank. So this is the expected behavior that we now know, knowing that project activity codes are going to keep the project ID. They're going to preserve that project ID with the code. We don't necessarily see it on the front end of P6, but that's exactly what is happening. So one of the options would be to come in here and simply find the new code and say, go ahead and group by that, and you've basically just recreated the same layout for this particular project. So that is one of the options that we do have, is to simply update the layout again. The key would be to find, make sure that the naming convention allows you to maybe easily find the project-specific activity code. So this example, on a second example we have down here, we see an EPS node that I created called ABC. And in a different database, I created the exact same EPS node, same EPS ID, ABC, and then I created this project that's called 4321, and it has just a few simple activities in here that are used. And we have a layout that I created that is called our EPS code. And this was just a very simple yes or no is the code value in here. So this is an EPS level activity code. So when I look here in my modify, so I see I've got ABC is my EPS, and this is the code name. So I can see that it groups here. I then imported what would have been a first update of the project. And notice that I've got some updated information. You can see I've moved the data date and just kind of changed a little bit around, but I did not have to do anything with this specific layout because it's now using an EPS level activity code. And once I import these projects, and maybe if I continue to import them into the same EPS, then my sync layout should work over and over and over throughout the course of the project. The trick to this is pretty straightforward, and it does make a lot of sense. The trick would be, number one, is making sure that if you're working with a contractor, maybe you can convince them to create an EPS node, say, that aligns with the project ID. And then also, if I were the owner organization or the person receiving the schedules, I would create the exact same EPS code to import. And then the second thing I would have to do is make sure that the EPS code exists in my database before I import. Because what I found in doing this kind of testing is that if the EPS code, activity code, the EPS level activity code is not in this database, it will just drop that code altogether during the import, and it just seemed to disappear, if you will. But any subsequent project that I would import that had an EPS level activity code from the contractor, if I put it into this section, then I can see that I will not have to recreate the layouts. And in fact, here I can see I've got both projects open, and the code values are there, and they are viewable within each project. So this is the one way that I did find, and it's probably the option to say update existing, as I mentioned, probably has a lot more risk to doing that based on what data might get lost or not come in cleanly. I think we all are preferring to create a new project when we do an import so that we can do our analysis. But this is one way that you could possibly resolve this issue, is to align the EPS in an EPS node in the contractor's database with an EPS node in the owner database, and then have a activity code that is named the same, so that when we import, that can come in. And if we're using a simple name like location or phase, whatever it might be, then the process even becomes easier at that point. But this is something that might be worth a try, might be worth investigating if redoing those layouts over and over does become problematic and something that we don't want to do repetitively over and over. So these would be maybe the potential options that I might take a look at if I were working with this particular problem. Okay, my next question here is, while working on Primavera P6, I'm getting a rather strange error when I'm linking my activities or giving any relationships whatsoever. The following error as the attachment pops up. So the error that we saw that was submitted with this question is a PRMEB access error. We have ORA 1295. Can someone help me out? I tried restarting and everything possible. Okay. What this error represents, if you have seen this, is that the request exceeds the maximum allowed database size of 4 gigabytes. So this could be when you install a standalone instance that's using one of the light versions of the Oracle database. I think the knowledge base article we found on this referenced the Oracle database. I can't recall the name of it. But it is possible that we exceed the overall limits. Now, one thing that in being able to work with maybe some of our IT folks who look at a lot of database environments are the things that create really a lot of size in a database are not always the number of projects. And we saw this recently with an individual that had maybe only a handful, a dozen projects, but they were getting an error like this. The dozen projects didn't have a ton of activities. They weren't huge schedules, but what they had were a lot of activity codes, a lot of UDFs, and a lot of baselines. So the underlying metadata is something that would need to be cleaned up. So if you do run into this type of error or have this condition, look back and see what baselines you have stored and ask yourself, can those baselines, if they're few years old, can those be exported for archive purposes, but can I then delete those from the actual database to remove the records? And the same with codes, user-defined fields. The metadata under the activities is what seems to start to really take up a lot of the size. So it's often not the number of projects that we have in the database that contribute to reaching a size limit, but it can be the metadata that's underneath it, and things like codes, ships, UDFs, baselines. Baselines would not be the metadata, but baselines are one thing that we like to make a lot of copies to make sure that we preserve what we've done at this point. And those are the things that, if you do run into this, to try to reduce the size of your database, to look at some of these items that you could possibly remove. The other option, as Oracle will tell you, is to deploy it on a standard Oracle database. Okay, our next question here is about tracking of expenses. So this question says, I've loaded expenses onto each of the activities and updated the project, but expenses are not able to reflect based on the % completed activities. This is something that, if you're using resources, we often expect that there's a setting that says update actual costs and units as % complete changes. This is what we have for the resource assignments. But with the expenses, it's not necessarily something that is automatic, like we might expect with the resources. So, but there are options that we can do if you are using the expenses. And so I wanted to talk maybe about the update progress function as well as apply actuals in looking at this. So I'll go back into our E6 database, and I have a number of copies of this particular project because we tried a number of different things to perhaps make this work. I'm going to open up a layout so we can see a little bit about what we have in this particular project. So we just have a few activities here, but we can see we have no progress on these activities, but each has an expense item of $10,000. We can see we have no actual, and our remaining and at complete are the same. So we do have the auto compute actuals button enabled at the activity level here. So let's see if we can just first reproduce the problem. So I'm going to come here and let's just do maybe an update of a few activities. So we'll say that this started and finished. We'll go to our next activity, started and finished. And then for our third activity, let's say we started and we have a 5-day remaining duration. I'm going to update the data date now to, let's say, the 28th and schedule. So I've updated my schedule, but now when we look at our activities, I see this activity is 100% complete, but none of my expenses have been updated to this point. So I can see what we have here is 100% complete and then 50%, but the expenses did not update automatically. One method would be to come in here and to update these % complete. But the first thing I want to try is to come in here and use one of the automated functions that says apply actuals. So when I say apply actuals, it's going to look at my project and say, do we want to update to the current data date, which we have as December 28th, and I'm going to apply my actuals. Now we'll get a window that pops up here that says this is greater than the current date. Do we want to continue? And we'll go ahead and say yes. Now, my first thought was this did not work. And what we need to, in version 16, which I'm using, all of these functions go through the job service. So hopefully you can see this down here, this message that popped up. I'll go to the job status. So we can see here that it actually runs through the job status, and that window that popped up said, the process completed, hit F5. So I simply hit the F5 key on my keyboard, and now I can see that activity, now my expense, actual expense is updated. I no longer have a remaining, and my at completion. So all of my expenses here, even the one activity where we had $10,000, the activity is 50% done. So it gives me an actual cost of $5,000 and a remaining. And so this would be the expenses operating like we would expect the resource. So getting back to the question, is there a way to automatically do this? So what you could do as part of the process, and what I just did here, is to update the activities in the schedule as you normally would. And in this project, I actually put down here on my notes. So the update activities as we normally would during the update process. Note that the activity percent completes will be updated, but the percentages for the expenses will not do it automatically. Once we've updated our activities, go to apply actuals and update the percent complete. And then note that the job service will run, making the change and updating the actual, and the user, once that's done, will be required to hit F5 when the process is completed. So here we can see now, I'll just show on the bottom, we have our updated activities, and our activity, the expenses associated with the activities have been updated automatically as well. There was one other option that we have available that we tried that did seem to work fine, which is to use update progress. So here is another sample, same project, but this is starting at square one. We haven't removed any of our data dates. So I'm going to now come here and I'm going to move my data date out, say, to this point here, to December 15th. And I'm going to this time say update progress. So it's going to ask, do I want to move my data date to this new date? Now what this is going to do, and you should check this first before you run this, but what this is going to do is it's going to update everything, all of my activities and expenses and resources. It's going to update them that says everything went as planned according to the planned dates of the activities. So make sure that your planned dates are equal to your start and finish dates here. And then when we hit apply, we can look and see that we've now, same thing happened. This activity was status to 100% complete. The next activity was going to be 60% done based on where we put the new data date, and it applied an actual expense cost of $6,000, and everything in here went according to plan. So these are two ways that you can address this problem of when I open up an activity or when I update a schedule and I'm using expenses to track costs, the activities themselves do not update automatically, and you have to manually go into another screen or go into each activity details and update, say, the actual cost or the percent complete. So these are two ways that you can use to possibly automatically update those items. Okay, let's go back here. We're running a little short on time. So the next question is asking about driving activities. Can I view the driving activity? Let me try this again. I'm trying to get a driving activities path for a given activity in the Gantt chart view, something like the trace logic, but using the bars. Is there any way to get a single click operation instead of clicking one by one with the go-to button in the relationships tab? So what we're going to talk about to address this particular question are using the float path options in P6. So to get to the float path options, the first thing you need to do is on the left side there, we hit our F9 key to bring up the scheduling window and then choose the options button that we would see on the bottom. The second window that pops up, go ahead and select the advanced tab. And then when we hit calculate multiple float paths, the one thing that I don't see in the screenshot, but you'll want to select the free float option. And then by clicking this ellipse, we'll be able to select an activity and generate a float path. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this question real quick. Actually, I'm going to open up the Harbor Point Assisted Living project. I'm going to open a layout First, I'll open up the standard view so we can see that the activities in here. Now, for those of you, I'm going to go through at least a little background of how I think I understand the question. Is, let's say I want to see the driving predecessors for this roof complete, and maybe I'm trying to develop a layout or a view to get this information for me. The way we would normally have to do this is, at least this is in my experience, is to, I'm going to look here and say, where's my button? Well, I'm going to run a filter for a specific activity. So the roof complete. And then what I have to do is I'm going to customize down here and make sure I'm showing what is the driving predecessors. And then what I have to do in order to build a layout, if I wanted to see all of the activities here, is to use this go-to button. And I can place and continue to select this go-to button. Oops. Until I get all the way back until I create this path. Now, this is a very simplistic sample of that. If you are dealing with schedules that have thousands and thousands of activities, the logic can be much more intricate, and it is not nearly this easy or straightforward. So what I wanted to do is isolate a single path for a group of activities. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select the F9 key, choose my options, come here to advanced, and I'm going to check the free float. I'm going to then select an activity, and within here I can type ahead so that I can filter down the list, find my roof complete. I only want to see one float path in this particular instance. So then I'll schedule, and now I've done that. So what I want to do along with this is create a layout that looks at my float path. And so here it's going to look at the float path for the roof complete and everything else. These are the same activities that we had by clicking go to, go to, go to, and drive it. So if we wanted to do other options, other activities, I can look through here and I could choose substantial completion. Maybe I just want to look for building 2 complete. Close. Now I do have to reschedule this every time. And here would be the float path for my building 2 complete. So this is much more, I think, to the question of can I do it with a single click? The answer is, well, we have a few clicks, but it's certainly more, it's a much more simpler process than using the go-to and jumping from activity to activity to create the layout. Only get to that one driving relationship that's completed and it throws everything off course. This is a simple way to select any activity and identify a chain of tasks that drive that particular milestone. So to answer this, this would be the way I would approach using a single click function to try and identify a driving chain of activities to a given task. And we've done this towards milestones, but you could do this for any activity in the schedule that you want to identify its float path. Okay. That was a good question there. I think float paths are something that are very valuable, but they're not often used too often. Next, do we know how to get the WBS to total of actual work days versus calendar work days? It shows now. So I'm assuming that this is related to grouping bands and displaying the summary information. So when we're looking at our schedule of activities, we can see a WBS summary, and the overall grouping band, if we're looking at something like original duration, they can be completely different. So let's take a look here at looking at our durations. And let's see if I don't think I created a layout for this, but let's just go ahead and use my standard. And with this, I'm going to add in maybe a couple of duration fields for my original duration and maybe an actual duration, because I think that's what this particular question is interested in. So this would be a good example. Let's see if I can put these up at the top. So here's a single activity where I've got a WBS summary that goes from December 1st to December 30th, and it has 30 days here, but the grouping band shows 22. Dates are the same, but the durations are different. So whenever we see anything like this, it's important. The first place to look would be the calendars. So the question might have been, hey, can I see the number of actual days, meaning not work days, but just lapsed calendar days? The simple way to do that would be to put the activities or just a summer task and use a 7-day calendar. And if I filter for, say, just WBS summaries, I'll see that this initial grouping band will show as 30 days as well. So just to kind of clarify a couple of points here is that when the activities in a WBS like segment 3 here all share the same calendar, the grouping band will use the same calendar as is displayed below. When I'm starting to commingle calendars, say I've got a 7-day calendar along with a 5-day calendar, P6 has to use some sort of tiebreaker with which to do this. But one of the places that you could look, or you will want to look, is at your project level, the default calendar. So this is set to 5-day full-time. If I wanted to make this a 7-day as the default calendar for this project, notice now my summary durations have changed to 32. Now they've only done it for this particular one. This one's still down here. It goes the entire month of February, but it still shows 20. So why is this grouping band calculating different from segment 2? Hopefully everybody can see that. And segment 3 as well. So we can see December 1st through the 30th, that's 30 days. December 31st to January 31st, it's actually giving us 32 days. And then 20 down here. So the point being here is that your calendars that are assigned to activities will influence what shows up here. If they're all the same, standard 5-day work week, what is displayed here in the grouping band will be reflective of the calendar used. Now, one important point is the duration here in the grouping band is not necessarily a roll-up of these values, okay? But rather, it takes the first and last, it takes these dates and applies the calendar and says how many work days are in this period. So it's not necessarily a roll-up, if you will, of these durations, okay? So that's the main thing to look at when you are checking your activities, is to look at what calendar they are using, and this way you can at least understand. Now, I love it when people continue to use a standard calendar throughout, but if you need a 7-day calendar, a 5-day calendar, understand that this is what can happen. I've got a single activity that's using same dates, the 1st to the 30th, but these two totals are different. One's using a 7-day calendar, one is using a 5-day calendar. And when I'm commingling them, it's going to use the project specific. It's going to use this project calendar to view the display. So once I change that to a 7-day work week, that's what it'll use here to say December 1st to the 30th, December 1st or January 1st to the 31st, 31 days. So the settings outside of the activities will help drive what the actual answer for that particular question is. So this is something we get commonly. The roll-up information looks different. Just understand that the calendars play a key role in determining how the information is displayed. All calendars the same, it will use that in the grouping band. When I'm using different calendars within a single WBS, it's going to look at the project or default calendars to say what's calculated here. Okay. Let's see, I think this might be our last question here. We're getting close on time. I've been having issues with the print preview in 15.2 when trying to add elements into the footer and header. I'm unable to add any of my variables from the drop-down list. Is there a fix for this? So this was a known bug, and there were a lot of chatter about this. And this is what it was printed from the Oracle knowledge base that has been fixed in 15.2 Service Pack 6. So whoever submitted this question, if they're using 15.2, you need to maybe check which patch set that you have installed to see if that, if you have the right patch set. If not, upgrade to this version here, Primavera 15.2 fix pack 6, and see if that doesn't resolve the issue. Okay. We're just about out of time, but Dan, if there's any questions maybe out there, I'll be happy to stay on and see if we can answer a few.
Yeah, we actually had quite a few questions submitted during your presentation, Brian, so I don't know if we will be able to get to all of them. Probably one of the easier ones to answer or to ask would be, when is it appropriate to use expenses in lieu of budgeted total cost?
Well, I'm not sure that when to use expenses. The option would be expenses versus, well, I guess I'm not sure of the question. If they're talking about when is the appropriate time to use expenses rather than resources, my opinion on that is if I'm doing an import, because an expense is a project-specific bit of data and resources are global information. If I have to import contractor schedule, one of the things I might include in my specifications might be that they include costs as expenses. Now, if you're on a project that necessitates resources for manpower usage and things like for those types of analysis, then absolutely, resources will be coming in. But if you don't need resources from a contractor, but you do want to track costs to have a cost-loaded schedule, expenses are good because they are contained within the project itself and they do not represent any global data. So that would be my answer as to when to use expenses or to when to use resources. But the budgeted total cost, I'm not quite sure if that answers their question. But if this does not, feel free, like I say, email me, call me. We can talk about that question in case I have it kind of wrong the way I've explained it.
All right, I know we've pretty much come to the allotted hour that we've set aside for this. And again, we did have quite a few questions submitted. We will take the time to answer every question that was submitted to us. As part of our follow-up, we will include the answer log with our answers to your questions that were submitted, not only online, but offline as well, too. We appreciate everybody taking the time to join us today. Brian, we thank you for the presentation, and I do believe you had another slide left for some upcoming events.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure everybody keep an eye out for our Loop, our monthly newsletter, and then if we hopefully we can catch up with you folks in person at a few events we have coming up that we'll be attending. The Western Winter Workshop, which will be at the Palm Springs Indian Wells Resort in March, and then also the CPM conference, the annual CPM conference in Orlando, coming in early January. We'll be there as well. We have a few people making presentations for those events. So just to follow up, I do appreciate everybody joining us. I'm interested in feedback from those of you who attended as to whether you found this kind of sessions user forum valuable. And if you'd like to see us continue it in the future, do let Dan or myself know. But with that, Dan, that's all I've got, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, Brian, again, thanks for the presentation. Everybody, we thank you for taking the time out of your probably extremely busy day and joining us. Again, we're going to put together the follow-up to send off to you. Expect that to go out the next day or so. And if any other questions arise, you can email us directly, or you can send it to info@drmcnatty.com. Again, we appreciate the time, and we look forward to seeing you in our next webinar.